A retired Navy SEAL loses his consulting job after woke employees brand his military achievements as glorifying violence. Forced to rebuild his life, he confronts a web of betrayal and public defamation. As he pieces together the truth, he uncovers a shocking conspiracy involving those closest to him. His journey reveals the devastating impact of cancel culture on individuals and families, while delivering a powerful message about resilience and redemption. The conference room buzzed with anticipation as David Kane, a retired Navy SEAL, stepped onto the stage. His commanding presence silenced the murmurs and the audience leaned in. He began with a gripping tale from his time in Afghanistan, a rescue mission that epitomized courage, teamwork, and sacrifice. The room seemed captivated, but as his story unfolded, David noticed a few attendees exchanging whispers and glances, their discomfort palpable. One woman frowned deeply, arms crossed, and a man near the back muttered under his breath, shaking his head. David shrugged off the unease, focusing on the majority, who listened intently. When he concluded with a heartfelt message about resilience, the room erupted into applause, though it felt muted compared to previous speeches. During the post-event reception, he approached Eric Whitman, the CEO and his mentor, expecting their usual camaraderie. But Eric's demeanor was oddly reserved, his smile forced, and his eye contact fleeting. "Great speech, Dave," he said, patting David's shoulder before quickly excusing himself to speak with someone else. The following morning, David was called into HR, the sterile office contrasting sharply with the camaraderie of the battlefield. The HR manager, Rebecca, avoided pleasantries, her tone clipped. "David, we've received several complaints about your presentation yesterday. Some employees felt it glorified violence and perpetuated harmful narratives." Her words hit like a gut punch. David sat straighter, his voice steady. "My stories are about leadership and teamwork under extraordinary circumstances. I share them to inspire, not to offend." Rebecca's expression softened momentarily, but quickly returned to neutral. "I understand your intent, but in today's climate, perception matters as much as intent. The company has a responsibility to maintain a safe and inclusive environment." David's protests about his service and his contributions to the company fell on deaf ears. He realized Rebecca wasn't there to understand, but to mitigate potential fallout. Her decision had likely been made long before he walked through the door. As the meeting dragged on, David's mind drifted back to his transition from military service to the corporate world. He had taken pride in reinventing himself, channeling his skills into leadership training and corporate consulting. The battlefield lessons, adaptability, perseverance, and loyalty were, in his view, universal. The idea that these values could now be twisted into something controversial felt surreal and deeply unjust. The final blow came when Eric's support proved lukewarm at best. When David confronted him after the meeting, Eric avoided the hard questions, offering vague reassurances. "It's complicated, Dave. The board is worried about optics. You're a great asset, but this is bigger than us." The words felt like a betrayal, stripping away the trust built over years of friendship. Eric had been one of the reasons David joined the company, but now he seemed unwilling to stand by him. By the end of the day, David's termination was official. There was no dramatic announcement, no farewell gathering. His profile disappeared from the company website, as though he had never been there. The speed of the erasure was disorienting, leaving him grappling with the stark reality of his situation. Stripped of his position and his reputation, he left the building in a daze, clutching a box of his belongings. That evening, as David scrolled through his phone, he stumbled upon an anonymous thread discussing his firing. The accusations were brutal and baseless, branding him a toxic relic and a symbol of outdated masculinity. The venomous comments snowballed, drawing strangers into a public character assassination. Each new post chipped away at his resolve, the weight of the vitriol more suffocating than he could have imagined. David sat alone in his darkened kitchen, a cold cup of coffee untouched beside him. In his hand was a photo of his SEAL team, their faces grinning with camaraderie and purpose. He whispered into the silence, "How did it come to this?" The photo felt like a relic of another life, one where loyalty and honor still mattered. His mind churned with questions, anger simmering beneath the surface as the enormity of his situation settled in. David sat at the dinner table, the air thick with silence. His wife, Lisa, glanced up from her plate, her eyes filled with concern and frustration. Their daughter, Claire, scrolled on her phone, her shoulders tense. "So, what happened?" Lisa finally asked, breaking the quiet. David hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's complicated. Some people misunderstood my talk. The company thought it was best to let me go." The explanation sounded hollow even to him. Lisa's fork clattered against her plate. "Misunderstood? David, this isn't just about you. We have bills, Claire's college. How are we supposed to manage?" Her voice was steady, but the cracks in her composure were evident. David felt a pang of guilt. "I'll figure it out," he said, though he wasn't sure how. Across the table, Claire's face darkened, her fingers tightening around her phone. "People at school are talking about it," she muttered. "They think you're some kind of monster." The next morning, the story had spread further. Headlines like, "Ex-SEAL's speech sparks outrage, a glorification of violence in the workplace," filled news feeds, each one twisting the narrative. David's phone buzzed with calls and messages, but they were either reporters looking for a comment or old acquaintances expressing polite regret about not wanting to get involved. The silence from his closest friends stung the most, their absence amplifying his isolation. At home, the tension grew. Lisa, ever practical, pulled up spreadsheets to calculate how long they could sustain their lifestyle on her income alone. Her frustration was palpable, but it was Claire's reaction that cut the deepest. She stormed into the kitchen that evening, her phone thrust in his face. "Look at this!" she shouted, tears welling in her eyes. David read the cruel messages from classmates mocking her father, calling her family a joke. The weight of his choices bore down on him. Flashes of his past filled his mind during the sleepless nights that followed. He remembered the early days of his career when Lisa supported his grueling schedule without complaint, juggling her own job while raising Claire. He thought of the promotions, the accolades, and the moments he promised her that their sacrifices would be worth it. Now, all he could see was the betrayal in her eyes, the look of someone questioning if it had been worth it at all. Desperate to provide for his family, David began reaching out to potential employers, but each attempt ended the same: polite rejections or outright ghosting. The controversy had made him a liability, and no one wanted to associate with someone branded as divisive. Even his military achievements, once his greatest pride, were now twisted by online commentators into symbols of toxic masculinity and archaic values. One afternoon, his old SEAL buddy, Jake, showed up unannounced. "Heard what happened," Jake said, his voice gruff but warm. "You're getting screwed over, man, but you're tougher than this." Over beers, Jake shared stories of his own struggles adapting to civilian life. "People like us, we're built to adapt. You've faced worse, Dave." His words were a lifeline, a reminder that not everyone had abandoned him. That night, David heard muffled sobs coming from Claire's room. He stood outside her door, his heart aching. He wanted to knock, to comfort her, but guilt kept him rooted in place. When he finally returned to his room, Lisa was already asleep. Alone in the dark, he stared at the ceiling, the sound of Claire's cries echoing in his mind. Her pain was a wake-up call, reigniting the fire within him. The next morning, David picked up the phone and dialed Jake. "Do you still have connections at that veterans nonprofit?" he asked without preamble. Jake didn't hesitate. "Of course. What are you thinking?" David's jaw tightened. "It's time to do something. I can't just sit here while my family suffers." His voice carried a new determination, a resolve to reclaim his life and fight back against the narrative that had upended everything. David stepped into the modest office of the veterans nonprofit, a space filled with second-hand furniture and walls lined with photos of smiling families reunited with loved ones. Jake had vouched for him, and the director, a stern but kind woman named Linda, welcomed him with a firm handshake. "We can always use another pair of hands," she said. David spent the day organizing workshops and counseling veterans grappling with PTSD, unemployment, and identity crises. For the first time in weeks, he felt useful, his skills serving a purpose beyond himself. One afternoon, As David helped a young veteran struggling to navigate job applications, Jake approached him with a woman in tow. "David, meet Sarah Blake," Jake said. Sarah was in her mid-30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing and a notepad clutched in her hand. "I'm working on a piece about the human cost of cancel culture," she explained. "Your story caught my attention." Her words were measured, her tone cautious, as if testing the waters. David hesitated, his instinct to protect his family colliding with the desire to set the record straight. "Why should I trust you?" he asked bluntly. Sarah didn't flinch. "Because people need to hear what happens when the world turns its back on someone for the wrong reasons," she said. Her sincerity struck a chord, and after a moment of silence, David agreed to talk, though his wariness lingered. Over coffee, David recounted the events leading up to his firing, his voice steady, but his emotions raw. Sarah listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "I didn't sign up for corporate politics," he said. "I wanted to teach people what my team taught me, resilience, loyalty, and how to push through when everything's on the line." Sarah nodded, her empathy evident. "It's not just you," she said. "This is happening to more people than you think." That night, as David lay awake, memories of his SEAL training surfaced. He thought of the grueling drills and the moments of camaraderie that forged unbreakable bonds. Integrity had been the cornerstone of everything they did. Without it, the team would fall apart. The contrast between those days and the present was stark. The betrayal he felt from Eric, and the company gnawed at him. But the work he was doing now gave him a renewed sense of purpose. A week later, Sarah returned with startling information. She had uncovered that several of the employees who filed complaints against David were affiliated with advocacy groups pushing for aggressive corporate cleansing campaigns. "It's not just about you," she said, spreading documents across the table. "They're targeting anyone who doesn't fit their vision of progress. Your firing wasn't just about appeasing the complaints. It was part of a broader strategy." David stared at the papers, anger and disbelief warring within him. Meanwhile, Lisa began noticing the change in David. He came home from the non-profit tired, but more focused, his despair slowly giving way to determination. One evening, she handed him a cup of tea and sat beside him. "I can see you're trying, David," she said softly. "That means a lot." Her words, though simple, felt like a lifeline. Claire, too, seemed less withdrawn, watching her father with cautious curiosity as he worked late into the night with Sarah. Just as things seemed to improve, Sarah received an anonymous email. The message was simple but chilling. "Drop the story or face the consequences." She showed it to David, her face pale, but her resolve intact. "This isn't the first time I've been threatened," she said. David's jaw tightened. "Whoever sent that doesn't want the truth to come out. We must be on the right track." David, staring at the evidence Sarah had compiled, his SEAL instincts kick in. "If they think I'll back down, they don't know who they're dealing with," he said, his voice firm. For the first time since his firing, he felt in control, ready to fight not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced by fear and manipulation. David and Sarah sat in her cluttered home office, the glow of her laptop casting a pale light across the room. "Look at this," Sarah said, scrolling through HR complaint documents. "Karen Fields, one of your accusers, has filed similar grievances at her previous jobs. 2 of them led to settlements, but both were dismissed once the claims fell apart." David leaned forward, his brows furrowed. "So, she has a history of making things up to get what she wants. Why didn't HR catch this?" As they reviewed more files, a disturbing pattern emerged. Several of the employees who had filed complaints against David were members of an internal advocacy group. Sarah cross-referenced their involvement, her eyes narrowing. "This group has been actively lobbying to oust veterans and former law enforcement from leadership roles. They claim it's about fostering inclusivity, but it seems more like targeted discrimination." David's jaw tightened as anger bubbled beneath the surface. The findings triggered memories of David's interactions with Eric in the months leading up to his termination. Flashbacks painted a picture of mounting tension. Eric, once a strong supporter, had grown distant, frequently undermining David in meetings and brushing off his ideas. David recalled one particularly heated exchange where Eric dismissed his strategy for a company-wide training program. Let's keep things softer, Eric had said. The words now rang hollow in his memory. Sarah pushed the investigation further by interviewing a former HR employee who had resigned shortly after David's termination. Over coffee at a quiet cafe, the employee, a young man named Peter, hesitated before speaking. There was pressure from above, he admitted. Eric was negotiating a partnership with an advocacy group. They wanted David gone. They saw him as a liability. I can't prove it, but everyone in HR knew what was happening. Sarah scribbled furiously in her notebook, her excitement tempered by frustration. David's suspicions of Eric deepened, but without concrete evidence, confronting him seemed premature. We need something undeniable, David said, pacing Sarah's office. If Eric's behind this, I won't let him hide behind vague accusations and half-truths. Sarah agreed, but warned that uncovering the truth could put them in danger. People are already trying to silence us, she said, recalling the threatening message she had received. Meanwhile, the strain on David's family began to resurface. Lisa opened a letter one afternoon, only to find a series of hateful messages. "What is this?" she demanded, slamming the papers onto the kitchen counter. David scanned the threats, his chest tightening. "They're trying to intimidate us," he said. But his attempts to reassure her fell flat. Claire, who had started to come out of her shell, became withdrawn again, retreating to her room and avoiding her friends. Sarah's investigation hit a breakthrough when she stumbled upon a series of emails buried in the company's digital archives. The messages hinted at coordination among senior executives to remove David, but key pieces of information were missing. Dates were redacted, and critical messages seemed to have been deleted. "Someone doesn't want us to find the whole picture," Sarah said grimly. David nodded. "Then we need to find someone who knows it." Late one night, Sarah received an anonymous email from an informant claiming to work within the company. The message was terse but promising. "I have information that can prove what happened to David wasn't a coincidence. Meet me tomorrow. Details to follow." Sarah read the email aloud to David, who leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "If this person is legit, they could blow this wide open," he said. Just as they were preparing to meet the informant, David's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It contained a single line. "You're looking in the wrong place. Start with Eric." The message sent chills down David's spine, confirming his worst fears. He stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. "Eric's been pulling the strings all along," he said, his voice steady. "Now we find out why." David sat alone in the living room, the shadows of the evening stretching long across the walls. The anonymous text replayed in his mind like a broken record. "Start with Eric." His fists clenched as doubt gnawed at him. Was Eric truly behind this? Or was he grasping at straws, desperate to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed his life? The stakes were enormous. One misstep could destroy what little stability his family still had. Flashbacks transported him to the early days of his corporate career, when Eric had been more than a boss. He'd been a mentor and a friend. Eric had been the first to champion David's transition from military service, inviting him to leadership retreats and praising his ability to inspire teams. David remembered their shared beers after long meetings, swapping stories about their families. To suspect Eric now felt like a betrayal of their history. Lisa's voice shattered his reverie. "David, you can't just sit here and brood." She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her face a mix of worry and frustration. "You taught me to stand up for what's right, to never back down from a fight. Why won't you fight for yourself?" David opened his mouth to respond, but her words hit too close to home. He had no answer. Later that night, Claire knocked hesitantly on his office door. "Dad, can I talk to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. She sat across from him, avoiding eye contact. "It's about school. People are saying things about you, about us. I can't take it anymore." Her vulnerability pierced David's heart. Claire, who had always been so confident, now looked defeated. "You've always told me to stand tall," she whispered. "So why won't you?" Claire's words stayed with David as Sarah called him the next morning with new findings. "David, I've been digging into that contract tied to Eric and the advocacy group. It's messy, hidden payments, vague terms. But one thing is clear. Eric stood to gain financially if the partnership went through. and your firing was part of the deal. David's pulse quickened. The pieces were starting to fit, but it still felt incomplete. The mysterious informant reached out again that evening, this time with a direct message. Meet me tomorrow. I'll give you the proof you need. The location was a quiet park on the outskirts of town. Sarah and David debated the risks, but the urgency in the message left little room for hesitation. If this person is legit, we can't afford to ignore them, Sarah said. David nodded, though unease churned in his gut. The next day, David approached the park bench, spotting a man in his late 30s wearing a hoodie and sunglasses. "You're David Kane," the man said without introduction. He glanced around nervously before sliding a USB drive across the bench. "Everything you need is on there. Emails, memos. Eric didn't just go along with this. He orchestrated it. He drafted the complaints himself to appease the advocacy group." David's hands shook as he pocketed the drive, a mix of fury and betrayal surging through him. Back at Sarah's office, they combed through the files. The evidence was damning. Emails from Eric instructing HR to prioritize the complaints, memos discussing the optics of firing a veteran, and financial projections tied to the advocacy group's partnership. It wasn't just negligence. It was premeditated sabotage. David stared at the screen, his face unreadable. "He did this to me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "He let me take the fall for his ambitions." Fueled by anger and betrayal, David made up his mind. Lisa, seeing the determination in his eyes, offered her quiet support. "Do what you need to do," she said, her hand resting on his shoulder. The next morning, David walked into Eric's office without knocking. Eric looked up, startled, as David shut the door firmly behind him. "We need to talk," David said, his tone steely. David stood in Eric's office, the USB drive still warm in his pocket. Eric looked up from his desk, startled by David's abrupt entrance. "David, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice uneasy. "Cut the act, Eric," David said coldly. He placed the USB drive on the desk. "I know everything. The fake complaints, the advocacy group deal, the money. You orchestrated it all." Eric's face paled, but he quickly regained his composure. Eric leaned back, trying to appear unbothered. "Look, David," he began, his tone patronizing. "You need to understand, this wasn't personal. It was about protecting the company." David slammed his fist on the desk. "Protecting the company?" he shouted. "You destroyed my life to save your own skin. Don't you dare pretend this was about anything but your greed and cowardice." Eric's mask slipped, his voice turning defensive. "You don't get it, do you?" he snapped. "You were a liability. Your military stories, your presence, it didn't fit the narrative anymore. The advocacy group made it clear, either you go or they pull their support. And without their backing, we lose millions." David's stomach churned at Eric's bluntness. "So, you sold me out to save your bottom line," he said quietly. Flashbacks of subtle slights resurfaced in David's mind. Eric's offhand comments about how David intimidated people in meetings, his growing reluctance to include David in key decisions, the way he downplayed David's contributions at events, all the signs of a betrayal in progress. "You've been setting me up for this for months," David realized aloud. Eric's silence confirmed it. Eric stood, his voice laced with bitterness. "You don't know what it's like, David. Always being in your shadow. People worshipped you, the hero Navy SEAL. What was I? Just another CEO. They never saw my work because they were too busy idolizing you." David stared at him in disbelief. "This was about envy?" he asked. "You ruined me because you couldn't handle my success?" The tension in the room boiled over. David stepped closer, his voice rising. "You could have had it all, Eric. Respect, loyalty, integrity. Instead, you chose to betray me and everything I stood for. You sacrificed your humanity for a paycheck." Eric met his gaze but said nothing. For the first time, David saw the guilt lurking behind his former friend's bravado. Storming out of the office, David felt a mix of anger and resolve. He couldn't let Eric get away with this. He called Sarah, who was already piecing together the story. "We have everything we need," she assured him. "This is going to expose not just Eric, but the whole toxic system behind your firing." David nodded, his determination hardening. "Do it," he said. "Tell the world." At home, David sat Lisa and Claire down. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," he warned them. "Once the story goes live, there'll be backlash, maybe even threats. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Lisa took his hand. "We've come this far, David. We're not backing down now." Claire nodded, her voice steady despite her nerves. "We'll get through this together, Dad." The next morning, Sarah hit publish on the exposé. Within minutes, it began spreading like wildfire. David refreshed the page, reading the headline over and over. "Corporate betrayal, the truth behind David Kane's firing." His heart pounded as comments and reactions poured in. Some were supportive, others vicious. But one thing was clear. The truth was finally out. The exposé spread like wildfire, igniting a storm of reactions across social media and news outlets. Headlines blared. "Corporate corruption unveiled," "Navy SEAL betrayed by CEO," and hashtags like #JusticeForDavid and #cancel culture began trending. People from all walks of life chimed in, some condemning Eric's actions, others questioning the broader implications of cancel culture. David's story became a lightning rod for a national conversation. Veterans and advocates for workplace fairness rallied behind David. Prominent voices spoke out, sharing their own experiences of being sidelined or misunderstood in civilian life. Slowly, public opinion began to shift. The narrative painted David not as a relic of the past, but as a symbol of resilience and integrity. For the first time in months, he felt the weight of isolation lifting. The pressure on Eric mounted. Shareholders demanded an emergency meeting, and employees circulated a petition calling for his resignation. As Sarah's article exposed the depths of Eric's deceit and the shady deals with advocacy groups, his carefully crafted image crumbled. Eric's silence only fueled the backlash, making his guilt more evident. One by one, David's former colleagues reached out. Their messages were a mix of apologies and admissions of guilt for not standing by him. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up," one wrote. "I was scared of losing my job." While their words provided some validation, they couldn't erase the months of pain and betrayal. David grappled with conflicting emotions. Vindication felt hollow in the face of what his family had endured. Flashbacks of his SEAL missions resurfaced, moments where failure meant life or death. The battlefield had demanded strength and clarity. But this new fight, one of reputational survival, tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. At home, the atmosphere lightened. Claire began to hold her head high at school, as classmates who had once ridiculed her now expressed admiration for her father's courage. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said one evening, her voice steady and sincere. Lisa too seemed to find renewed strength, rallying behind David as they rebuilt their family's foundation. An unexpected email landed in David's inbox. It was a job offer from a company renowned for its commitment to veterans and ethical leadership. The CEO wrote, "We need people like you, leaders who've faced adversity and come out stronger. Let's talk." For the first time since his firing, David felt a spark of hope for the future. Walking through the doors of his new office a week later, David paused to take it all in. The environment was starkly different from the corporate world he'd left behind. Collaborative, supportive, and grounded in shared values. He felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in years, as though his struggles had led him exactly where he was meant to be. Standing outside the building after his first day, David reflected on the long journey. The betrayal, the pain, the fight for truth. It had all brought him to this moment. He looked up at the sky, the sun setting in hues of gold and crimson, and whispered, "We're not defined by what breaks us, but by how we rise." David's first days in his new role were a mix of anticipation and cautious optimism. The company's mission to support veterans felt like a perfect fit, offering him an outlet for his leadership skills and a renewed sense of purpose. Surrounded by people who valued his experience, David began to rebuild his confidence, one small success at a time. Inspired by Sarah's relentless commitment, David partnered with her to launch a nationwide campaign, Strength in Transition, aimed at helping veterans navigate civilian careers. They secured funding through donations and sponsorships, creating mentorship programs and job placement initiatives. For the first time in months, David felt like he was making a difference again. Flashbacks to his darkest moments surfaced as he worked. Sitting alone in his kitchen, his name dragged through the mud, Claire crying in her room. Each memory reminded him of the steep climb he had endured. Yet, instead of feeling bitterness, David felt gratitude for the strength those trials had forged in him. At home, the bonds within his family deepened. Lisa, once consumed by fear and frustration, became his strongest advocate, helping organize community events for the campaign. Claire, buoyed by her father's resilience, found her voice in school debates and began advocating for mental health support for students. Together, they embraced the healing process. An unexpected invitation arrived in David's inbox, an opportunity to speak at a national conference on cancel culture and resilience. The request, backed by influential figures who had followed his story, marked a turning point in his journey from disgrace to redemption. Initially hesitant, David realized this was his chance to turn his scars into a message of hope. The day of the conference arrived. Standing backstage, David felt a mix of nerves and determination. As he stepped onto the stage, the applause was thunderous. He looked out at the audience, veterans, advocates, and everyday people moved by his journey, and began his speech. "We're all more than the moments that break us," he said. "What defines us is how we rise, how we learn, and how we help others find their footing." He shared his story openly, weaving together his military background, his corporate betrayal, and the hard-won lessons of rebuilding his life. His words resonated deeply, drawing tears and cheers from the crowd. When he finished, the standing ovation felt like a cathartic release, not just for him, but for everyone who had followed his story. As David stepped off the stage, Lisa and Claire were waiting for him in the wings. Their embrace was tight and full of unspoken emotion. "You did it," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. Claire's eyes shimmered with pride as she said, "You're my hero, Dad." In that moment, David felt the weight of his journey lift, replaced by a profound sense of peace. The conference marked the beginning of a new chapter for David. As he continued his work with Sarah and the campaign, his story inspired countless others to stand up against injustice and reclaim their narratives. Looking back, David saw not just the scars of his battle, but the strength and legacy they had forged, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.